Welcome to the Strong America Tour presentation. I'm going to share my screen right now, and we're going to get at it. Invited in hundreds of places last year. We put out a little notice and said, hey, would anybody like us to come and chat in your community? And we had, at one point, I want to say we were getting close to 300 different places that had asked us. I lost track at a certain point. It just got overwhelming. Our goal was to make it to as many as we can. We did, I think, 55 or 56 stops in the last 3 months of 2019. And our goal going into 2020 was to try to hit as many of those remaining that we could, to get out there and speak to as many people. Obviously, no one's traveling now. And so we're very pleased, very happy to be able to offer this presentation to all of you. Hopefully, if you didn't get a chance to see it, this will be a good opportunity, and you can invite your friends, invite your coworkers. We're going to be doing presentations like this every Tuesday for the next few weeks at least. We'll see how long we're all stuck here indoors. I have to click on the screen or the slide's not going to advance. There we go. Real quick, Strong Towns, our mission is to support a model of development that allows our cities, towns, and neighborhoods to become financially strong and resilient. Obviously, we're having a moment right now, and I think that is going to grow. Our cities are financially frayed. They're very fragile, and we have a lot of work to do, not only rebuilding our economy, but just strengthening our places. And so we're very happy you're here participating in this conversation with us. This presentation all comes out of a book, Strong Towns, A Bottom-Up Revolution to Rebuild American Prosperity. If you would like to get that book, you can get it literally anywhere you buy books. It is available. It's selling it ridiculously cheap. We had an insider deal where we could get things a little bit lower price, and actually Amazon, Barnes, and all these places are selling it cheaper than we can get it. So go get a copy, go get 2 copies, pass them out, hand them around. I've been starting this presentation the way I end chapter 3 of the book, and that is talking about Detroit. As I've traveled around the country for the last decade, talking to people about cities and city development and why cities struggle financially, the conversation always seems to come back to Detroit. And that's because everybody has a narrative about Detroit. If you're on the political left, you have a complete, coherent narrative about Detroit that you can use to explain exactly what happened and how. If you're on the political right, you have very much the same thing. You have a complete, coherent narrative to explain what went on in Detroit and why. The problem with those narratives is there's no overlap. There's only one point actually of overlap, and it's the only point of consensus that I've found in any conversation about Detroit across North America. That is, we are not Detroit. If I'm in a big city, a small city, a West Coast, an East Coast, a Midwest, whatever place that I'm in, the people there are absolutely positively sure that their city is not Detroit, and that whatever went on and happened in Detroit has no relationship at all to their place. This is not our narrative, and this is not the Strong Towns way to describe Detroit. Here's the narrative, here's the explanation in a very rough sense that I would give about Detroit. When we look at Detroit of the late 1800s, early 1900s, this was one of the most wealthiest cities, not just in North America, in the entire world. This is a place of such opulence and wealth that you can go there today and still see the vestiges of it. You can still see a place like the Detroit Opera House, which will blow your mind. You could literally pick this thing up and drop it into any cosmopolitan capital of Europe, and this building would be right at home. It is a gem. It's an amazing place. As Detroit was experimenting with becoming the auto city, as they were becoming really the first place to kind of pioneer a new pattern of building and growth. They were the first place to experiment with this idea of we can have commuter suburbs. We can have people who work in the center of the city live out on the edge, and then drive back and forth. They were the first ones to put this in place at a large scale around the automobile. They were the first ones to run the highways through the middle of the neighborhoods. They were the first ones to tear down buildings and create parking lots. They were the first ones to create and evolve a commuter mentality. And when we look at Detroit, as the country kind of sank into depression and number two, Detroit did comparatively well. Detroit actually added jobs. Detroit actually had prosperity. While other cities around the country struggled, Detroit was actually kind of this beacon of prosperity. And so it was very clear to everyone, all the mayors and city councils, all the Rotary Club presidents and what have you around the country, as we were coming out of World War II, what they needed to do if they wanted to have prosperity. They needed to copy the development pattern of our most successful city, that being Detroit. And that's exactly what they did. In my mind, Detroit is not some strange anomaly. It's not some weird, freakish place, unlike your place or my place or any place we've ever been. Detroit's just early. They're just a couple decades ahead of everybody else. When you take a wealthy, prosperous city and you spread it out over a huge area, driving up the costs and denuding the tax base, you get the insolvency of Detroit. Like all bankruptcies, it happens gradually, then all at once. What Detroit did, and what our other cities subsequently followed along with, is to take a system, a development pattern that was complex and adaptive, and shift to one that was merely complicated. Let's break down that analysis a little bit. We can think of a rainforest as a complex adaptive system. We understand that a rainforest is made up of many different types of flora and fauna. They all act independently of each other. They're all able to receive input and stimulus from the surrounding environment, respond to stresses and opportunities. They all impact each other in this complex ecosystem. We grasp that this is a complex adaptive system. Sometimes we forget, or we don't necessarily respect, that human habitat for thousands and thousands of years had the same type of characteristic. Humans came together, they would build things, they would adapt and change and flex over time. Human habitat, at its essence, at its core, is a complex adaptive system in the same way that a rainforest is. Complex adaptive systems are different from systems that are merely complicated in a variety of ways. This is a Rube Goldberg machine. And part of the novelty of a Rube Goldberg machine is that it is complicated. There's a lot of different things going on. But if you cut one of these strings or move one of these blocks, the machine doesn't evolve and adapt into something new. It just stops working. If you think of an automobile engine is a very complicated machine. There's a lot of different parts. There's a lot of different stuff going on. But if you stress an automobile engine, if you push it beyond its capabilities, it doesn't evolve and adapt and become a toaster or a wash machine. It just breaks. It just stops performing the function that it was designed to do. This is the essential difference between systems that are merely complicated and systems that are complex. When we look at complex systems, there's ability to adapt to stress, to adapt to opportunity. If we took a rainforest and we dumped a whole bunch of water on it in 1 year, or we starved it of water 1 year, the rainforest would adapt and change, but we wouldn't expect that environment to collapse. It's essentially strong and interwoven, and while it would adapt and become something slightly different, the whole ecosystem would not collapse with that stress. Look at a cornfield, which is a complicated system, not a complex system. And if you give it too much rain in a season, or too much sun in a season, or not enough rain, it doesn't evolve and become soybeans. It just stops working. It just ceases to function. We see the same type of thing in human habitat. Human habitat of the past, cities of the past, when we subjected them to stress and pressure and opportunity, they would adapt and change and evolve and grow stronger. When we look at cities of today, well, they are very efficient, and we can create this model over and over and over in a very efficient way. It is merely complicated. We have actually, by design, frozen these systems in place and not allowed them to adapt and change and respond to the environment around them. They are, in a sense, fragile. When I say that cities of the past were complex ecosystems, complex human habitat, what I'm talking about is the way they were assembled. These were places that were assembled incrementally on a continuum of improvement. This is my hometown, Brainerd, Minnesota, where I'm at right now. This is what it looked like back in 1870. It's the very first iteration of this place. And you'll note that, while these little pop-up shacks represent kind of the frontier town in Minnesota, this intensity of development also represents the start of every city that was ever built in all of human history before modern times. We can go back to early Manhattan. We can go back to London, Paris, Rome. We can go to the great cities of Egypt and Africa. And what we see is that at their very first iteration, this is what they were: a series of pop-up shacks, some hopes and some dreams about the future. As more and more people would move to a place like this, the place would become more of a place. The actual underlying land would start to gain value, while the buildings on them would deteriorate and go bad. That difference, the rising land values of a growing place, along with the stagnant or deteriorating actual building value, would create this natural redevelopment pressure that would induce a higher and a more intense use on the property. So what you would see is that a place that was successful would start with an iteration like this. And over time, as that success kind of built upon itself, you would get this natural redevelopment. Here's the same exact street 30 years later. Those little pop-up shacks have all been torn down, and now they're 2- and 3-story buildings. Pause for a second and think about what you would have seen if you had gone a block or two off of this main street through town. You would have seen buildings that were very much like this. They were at this stage of their development. They were at essentially the infant stage, the beginner stage, the starting stage. There is a place for everybody, in a sense, to get started in a city like this. This is traditional human habitat. And of course, after another 3 or 4 decades, in this case, different time frames in other places, you would see more and more people move to this place. The underlying land values continue to grow. That natural redevelopment pressure coming to bear, and you would see the next increment of intensity, these 2- and 3-story wood buildings becoming buildings of more permanence, buildings of brick and granite. This is the way that complex human habitat grows and evolves. And when we study cities throughout time, what we see is different renditions of this same approach, different renditions of this same pattern. Places that start small, as very little bets, as things are successful, they evolve and mature to the next level. A lot of times people will indicate that the big thing that changed with the development pattern in North America is the automobile. We introduced the automobile, and the automobile changed everything. The reality is this picture has automobiles here. You can go to other parts of the world that have not adopted the North American development pattern, and they have automobiles. That's really not the fundamental change. The fundamental change we made is we shifted from a development pattern that was incremental, based on a continuum of improvement over time, to one that now we build all at once and we build to a finished state. Everything is built all at once and it's built to a finished state. Things are no longer allowed to adapt, evolve, and change over time. And so here's what this exact same street looks like today. It's a wasteland of parking lots and half-occupied buildings. And the most unfortunate thing about this place today is that when we look and we see, not only does it lack vitality, not only does it lack the humanity, there's $500,000 that we've invested in that little stretch of street right there. In the sewer, the water, the roads, the sidewalks. Where is the wealth that's going to sustain that investment? Where's the wealth that is going to provide the platform to sustain that street generation after generation after generation? It's gone. The liability is there, but the wealth is absent. Why did we make this shift? And I feel very strongly that it's important for us to understand that this wasn't some, radical dream that people came up with. We just threw out what worked and decided to try something new. People were responding to actual stresses. And this seemed like, and I'm going to quote Jim Kunstler right now, this seemed like a good thing to do. These seemed like a good set of ideas. When we look at the generation that went through the Great Depression and World War II, we have to understand that these were people that lived through something tremendous. My grandfather was a Marine. He was one of the first in Nagasaki at the end of, after the bomb was dropped at the end of World War II. And he told me that he would have died had it not been for FDR and the New Deal. This seemed a little, maybe a little rhetorical embellishment to me. Yet, you know, when he described what he lived through during the Great Depression, it was amazing. Here's a guy who could not live in his own house, wound up for reasons of survival, moving in with the neighbors. They allowed him to sleep in the barn. And in exchange, he worked the farm fields and they fed him. This was how he lived a number of years during the Great Depression. When this generation looked and struggled, they ultimately emerged from this, at least economically speaking. We got back to something resembling full employment and economic growth when we entered into, of course, World War II. The idea of confusing this, and sometimes I think today with the conversations we're having about our economy and how we fix our economy and what we do, about our economic conditions, one of the things that we, I think, mistake is we look back at World War II as being the solution to the Depression. Here's what we did in World War II. We took millions of working age people and we shipped them off overseas to kill and to die. And we took millions of other people and we put them into work in the industries of destruction, building bombs and tanks and munitions and airplanes. There was food rationing. There were people going without. There was fuel rationing. These are not like great times of human flourishment. Yet people had jobs. The economy was moving again. This quote on the screen here is from an economist named Paul Samuelson, that he wrote as the war ended. His concern of the economy and FDR and other thinkers of the day was that once we bring home all these troops, once we demobilize all these industries, there is nothing fundamentally different about our economy that's going to keep us from going right back to the Great Depression. We're just going to go right back to where we left off before this war started. Of course, we've got hindsight, right? We know that that's not what happened. What happened is the economic ever experienced in human history, 2+ decades of management where we had growth, we had lots of, essentially all of that capacity to build and create and putting it to work, rebuilding a new version of America. Understand where we were at this point in time. We were the world's leading industrial power. We were the only major industrial nation not decimated by war. We had all the gold, like literally we had the gold. We had the world's reserve currency. Economically, we were sitting on top. We had lots of oil. It was very cheap. It was very easy to extract. And we took all of this capacity and we turned it into building a new version of America. And here's the thing, it worked. The goal was to create growth. The goal was to create jobs. The goal was to create economic development. We still nostalgize this period of time in American history because it did exactly what we set out to do. Let's take a look at city of Fresno, California. This is the boundaries of Fresno as they looked in 1897. And I'm going to show you now how they change over time. You're going to see here's that pre-Great Depression incremental pattern of development, the city growing incrementally up, incrementally out, becoming incrementally more intense. Here's where that gets us at the end of World War II. Now the troops come home, we demobilize, we reorient all of our capacity into building a new version of America, this new style of building. And here's what happens to our cities. This is Fresno in 58, in 70. We see this massive horizontal expansion that typifies the period of growth that we saw after World War II. This is that horizontal expansion, iterating the same pattern over and over and over in a way that is complicated, but not complex. Of course, this creates a ton of economic growth. And even today, I mean, you're already hearing now with the current economic downturn, we're 2 weeks into what has been a massive, massive reset. And you're already hearing rumblings of how are we going to get people back to work? What type of stimulus can we do? There's discussion already about getting out and building more stuff and getting construction workers back to work. The reason is because in a very A plus B equals C kind of way, this spending creates immediate growth. It creates immediate GDP. It solves an immediate problem, particularly when that problem is measured at the macro level. Here's the trick. And here's kind of the downside of this. When we measure it at the block level, at the neighborhood level, at the community level. These are statistics from Lafayette, Louisiana. At the end of World War II, Lafayette, Louisiana had a population a little over 33,000. Today, it's a little over 121,000. It's a 3.5 times increase. It's a huge amount of population growth. When we look at Lafayette, Louisiana, though, at the end of World War II, it took 5 feet of pipe per person to provide water to the people in Lafayette. Today, it takes 50 feet of pipe. That's a 10x increase. When we look at something like fire protection, at the end of World War II, it took 2.4 hydrants per 1,000 people. Today, it takes 21 times that to provide fire protection for the city of Lafayette. Now, when you look, you say, okay, our population grew by 3.5 times, but our liabilities grew by 10 times and 21 times. This is not a viable way to build unless we're becoming wealthier and more prosperous, unless we can actually afford more, unless this is actually resulting in us becoming better off. But when we look at this, when we ask some fundamental questions about how are the people of Lafayette, Louisiana actually doing, much like we see in other cities around North America, while our liabilities grow by 10x and 20x, our wealth actually isn't keeping up. Median household income in Lafayette is only up 1.6 times. When we look at families in Lafayette, we see very much like the median family across the United States, they are saving less, they are taking on more debt, they are becoming over time financially more and more fragile. This development pattern creates a lot of growth very quickly. It allows us to meet next quarter's GDP numbers. It allows us to meet next quarter's unemployment numbers. But it does it by having our local cities, our local communities take on enormous amounts of liabilities, essentially drowning them in unpayable obligations while also denuding their overall tax base. This is a neighborhood just adjacent to mine here in the city of Brainerd. Apologize, I need some more Mountain Dew. These are 2 identical blocks in that neighborhood. We've written about this set many times because this is a fantastic case study in putting growth over stability, putting growth over wealth creation. If you look at these 2 blocks, they're the same size, the same area, they have the same amount of public infrastructure. They're just developed in a different way. That block on the left is a traditional development pattern. In fact, these 3 blocks here were built in the 1920s. This was the far edge of town. So what you're looking at is that pop-up shack that would have been on the far edge of town back in the 1920s. And had the city continued to grow, as cities had for thousands of years, you would have eventually seen 2nd and 3rd stories. You would have seen buildings become more intense, more ornate. Of course, that's not what happened. What happened was these were built. We had the Depression, we had World War II. Now we have a new experimental style of building that just skipped right over these blocks and started out on the edge. These 3 blocks have stagnated for almost a century now. That block on the right used to look just like the block on the left. We got it torn down and redeveloped. And now we have the brand new Taco John's drive-through. You can think of this, if you've not heard of Taco John's before, you can think of this as Norwegian Mexican food. Very popular here in central Minnesota. These blocks are the exact same size, the exact same area. They have the exact same cost to the public to service and maintain. The thing is, they have a radically different revenue. That block on the left is worth today $1.1 million. That block on the right, the same size area, the same amount of public infrastructure, just a different style of development, is only worth $600,000. This is a very vivid example because it gives you, in a sense, like an apples to apples comparison of tradition, that complex adaptive system, the one that responds to feedback, the one that changes and evolves with us over time, versus the kind of top-down, centralized, very efficient, complicated system of building in this new style of development, this new experimental style. This is not a cherry-picked example, though. This is a pattern we see repeated over and over and over again. A very good friend of mine named Joe Minicozy, his group at Urban 3 out of Asheville, North Carolina, does these fantastic 3D digital models of cities looking at financial productivity. If you think of a farmer going out and spreading seed across a field, the parts of the field that grow up the most robustly, we say that's the most productive part of the farm field. So where in the city are you seeing the most productivity? Where are you seeing the most value per acre? What I'm going to show you right now in the third dimension, brought to us by Joe and his team at Urban 3, is that financial productivity. So this is Buffalo, New York. For those of you not familiar with Buffalo, New York has lost population every single year since World War II. It's been a steady downward decline of disinvestment. Yet when we step back and we look at Buffalo and say, where is the wealth in Buffalo? Can you point to the traditional downtown? Can you point to that complex human habitat that was assembled prior to the Great Depression? Even though today it struggles mightily, and if you walk through there, you will see that. It will be very visible and very visceral. These places still contain an enormous amount of wealth and productivity. We see this in cities of all sizes and all shapes, all geographies. Joe's team has modeled hundreds of cities across North America. And we see the same pattern in cities that are big, cities that are small, cities on the coast, cities that are northern, that are southern or interior. We see the same general pattern. Patterns of development built prior to the Great Depression tend to be financially more productive. These are neighborhoods that are walkable. These are neighborhoods that are adaptable. These are neighborhoods with a flexible building style. The stuff that we see built after World War II has a far lower financial productivity. The development there has much higher costs, has much lower return, and is not able to adapt and evolve over time. This is true whether the neighborhoods are occupied by the affluent or whether they're occupied by the poorest people in the community. Same pattern over and over. This is a little town where I live, Crosby, Minnesota. When I first went here as a city planner, they said, Chuck, we've got some great stuff happening out here on the edge of town, but that stuff in the middle really is nasty. We got to get it torn down and get something redone. And then we showed them where their wealth is. Their wealth is in those core neighborhoods, those neighborhoods where all their poor people are living. We titled our book, the subtitle, A Bottom-Up Revolution to Rebuild American Prosperity. And the reason we did that is because we, at this point, need to inject the complexity back into our development pattern. We need a development pattern and investment strategy that is responsive to the humans in our cities, are responsive to their needs, are responsive to what is happening in their neighborhoods, is responsive to them, that allows our communities to adapt and evolve and meet the challenges of our time. This cannot happen from Washington, D.C. It can't even happen from our state capitals. The way that this adaptation happens, the way if we want smart, adaptable cities, this only happens at the block level by empowering people to be able to make changes and lead and direct the way that our communities evolve and adapt. So we're calling for a bottom-up revolution. Let me help you think about what this looks like, or how to kind of process the shift that needs to happen right now in our thinking. There's a saying out of Silicon Valley that we're quite fond of. It goes like this: innovation that happens from the top down tends to be orderly but dumb. Well, innovation that happens from the bottom up tends to be chaotic but smart. We all want smart over dumb. And if we were to go ask people today, which would you prefer? Would you prefer a response that is smart or a response that is dumb? Everyone's going to say, like, we want things to be smart. We want things to work smart. That's what we want. But if you actually look at Americans, you look at the way we live, you look at the way we react to stress, we have an overwhelming preference for order over chaos. Just even now, you can see today, we're talking about, how do we bail out massive corporations? How do we bail out massive banks? How much money do we have to throw at this system to keep it orderly instead of chaotic? And it's a panic. It's a visceral panic that we all feel. This is natural. This is a natural human inclination, particularly among affluent people. We prefer order over chaos. We have a very strong preference for that. But if we want to see smart responses, if we want our cities to grow strong, if we want them to become resilient, we have to tolerate at least a small amount of messiness at the block level. This is another one of those maps that Joe's team has put together, but this one is different than the ones before. The ones before were financial productivity. They looked at the value per acre, how much wealth is being created per acre in this community. This is the city of Lafayette, Louisiana. We're part of, with Joe's team, a very big study to look at these issues. And what you're looking at here is a map that shows the parts of the city that generate more revenue on an annual basis than they have an ongoing expense, and the opposite, the places that cost more to maintain than they're providing annually in revenue. The blue places are the ones that are quote unquote profitable in a municipal balance sheet sense, and the red ones are the exact opposite. They're the ones that are costing more money to provide that service than they produce in revenue. You can look at this map and you can kind of intuitively figure out what's going on. You've got that blue area in the middle with the spikes. That is the core downtown of Lafayette, Louisiana. To the right, to the east, as you're looking at this, is kind of a crescent of blue that runs through those neighborhoods. Those are the poorest neighborhoods in the community. Again, profitable. All the rest of the stuff on this map is red. That would be things like the big box stores, the gas stations, the malls, the strip malls, the drive-through franchise restaurants, the curvy streets, with the cul-de-sacs and the three-car garages with the attached house. Here's what this blue area looks like. Up on the top there, you've got the core downtown of Lafayette, Louisiana. This is a place that I have affection. I love the people, love the place. But no one's going to look at this downtown and say, this is the peak of prosperity. There's a lot of work yet to do there. They are working on that. They're very smart, innovative people. But they're a long ways from prosperity. That picture on the bottom there, on the right, that's kind of a representative sample of one of those poor neighborhoods. And just so we're clear, this is not because not because they're not maintaining stuff and not doing the work. Our model assumed that the city was out there maintaining the streets, maintaining the water drainage, maintaining the sidewalks, doing the stuff that they're expected to do. The fact that they're not doing that, and they're clearly not, only makes that blue higher. It only makes those neighborhoods technically more profitable in a sense because they're not doing the work. Those red neighborhoods out on the edge, Here's kind of representative samples of those. This is stuff we've seen. This is that complicated, but not complex development pattern, repeated over and over and over. These places are highly, highly red. Overall, within the city of Lafayette, Louisiana, the median family pays $1,500 a year in taxes to the city. In order to maintain everything that has been built, in order to make good on all these promises the city has made as they've grown and developed, the median taxes need to go from $1,500 to $9,200. One out of every $5 a family makes, we need to get sent back to the city just to maintain what they already have. That's not going to happen. And there's no chance that that ever happens. And so at some point in the future, the city is going to be faced with the same choices that Detroit was faced with. What pipes do we fix? What pipe do we let fall apart? What street do we repair? What street do we let go of? What neighborhood do we keep? What neighborhood do we walk away from? These are not easy choices. But even before the current financial meltdown and the current economic condition we find ourselves in with coronavirus, this is an incredibly fragile situation. The biggest question I get on this map is how, how did this happen? Like what is causing this? This is so inverted to the way we think about wealth being built in our societies. We think about that stuff on the left as being the stuff we want. That's the stuff that is creating all the wealth, and the stuff on the right as the poor places. Like that's the stuff draining us dry. And the reality is it's the opposite. And that blows our minds. How can this possibly be, Chuck? I'm going to give you a couple examples, and I'm going to lead that off by saying something that I know will be dissatisfying to a lot of you that want essentially the answer. Here's my dissatisfying answer. It's complex. There's a lot of things going on, a lot more things going on than I am able to grasp in my own brain. And the funny thing is that every time I think I know something, I learn something new about a neighborhood, about a place, about a system that blows my mind. There's so much here. And that is the very nature of complex adaptive systems. They defy our capacity to understand or to simply quantify. Let me give you just a few basic examples. First, in Lafayette, Louisiana, the first people who moved there, where did they move? Lafayette, Louisiana is a swamp. As a Minnesotan going down there, I was overwhelmed by the fact that this is just a hot, humid swamp. If you're the first person moving here, where do you build? Well, you build on the high ground. And you build on the high ground because God drains it for you, right? All that blue stuff, that's all the high ground. A lot of that red stuff is stuff that has to have expensive, continual drainage in order to make it workable. We saw a number of neighborhoods in that blue area where the sewage would flow from the house in a small pipe, flow into a large pipe, and then flow down to a lift pump where it would be pumped out to their sewage treatment facility. We saw some places in those red areas, particularly along the far north side there, where the sewage would come out of the house in a small pipe, go into a large pipe, and then drain down to a lift pump, and then be pumped through a succession of miles of pipe and multiple pumps before getting to the sewage treatment facility. If you look at this from the city standpoint, these are both considered one account. And so they both have the same amount of revenue. Two different homes pay the same amount, but one has dramatically more costs than the other. These are things that just add up cumulatively over time. There's a concept from a book that I read. Most strong town, this notion called thigmotaxis. Thigmotaxis is a term for our comfort or creatures that are comfortable with edge conditions. If you think of a mouse scurrying across a room, they'll stick near the edge of the wall. If you think of a deer in a field, they'll stick near the edge of the field. If you look at microbes under they will have a random pattern of travel until you put a metal rod in the petri dish, and then they will all line up along the metal rod and in kind of a spooky way move in a very similar direction. This is stigmataxis. Stigmataxis, in a sense, makes us feel comfortable in a place. Look at that downtown. What do you see? You see walls. You see walls that line up. At some point in our, past, our ancient past, maybe our primordial past, humans evolved and figured out that they can build the most comfortable habitat by creating walls and having them spaced a certain distance apart. It in a sense, calmed some primal urges that resides in all of our brain stems. If you look at that picture on the right, you don't see walls. This is a neighborhood in kind of its infant phase, but you can see the buildings lining up nonetheless. And you can imagine a neighborhood like this evolving and changing over time. And what would happen? Those houses would start to expand, they'd start to grow, there'd be buildings put in between, and eventually you would have a wall. This is the construction of human habitat. On the left, what do we see? We don't see anything like that. We see habitat that is, in a sense, from a human standpoint, neurotic. It is not designed to comfort any primal urges. It's actually designed to, in many ways, do the opposite, put us on hyper alert. All these signs, all these flashing things, they're designed to give us a sense of tension as opposed to a sense of calm. If you move to one of those poor neighborhoods in the early days of Lafayette, Louisiana, one of the things that you knew and understood intuitively, because it was part of the programming of the place, is that if you and your neighbors did not produce enough wealth to maintain the street in front of your property, you were going to go away. Like that, like no one else was going to do that. That was a threshold for viability. And whether that meant you had to produce enough wealth that could be taxed that would pay someone else to do it, or whether it meant you had to produce enough wealth where you and your neighbors would have the capital amongst you, social or what have you, however you were going to measure it, to get your shovels and your rakes and go out and maintain your street. That was what it was going to take to have this place work. If you knew that and understood that, how would you build your house? Well, you would build your house narrow and deep. And you would build it narrow and deep because then you would share that burden, you would share that cost with many, many, many more property owners along the same street. Well, let's pretend now you lose that feedback. The viability feedback is not something that's part of the programming anymore. The system has evolved from being complex to being merely complicated. We're not getting that painful feedback that this neighborhood, this style of development isn't exactly working. And so what happens is that over time, this development pattern just shifts and that same building just rotates on its side. Now you get a building that is broad and shallow. This is how you go from having 5 feet of pipe per person to 50 feet of pipe per person without generating any additional wealth. So when we think about what needs to happen now and how we start to patch our neighborhoods back together, we can look at this, the apex species of our current development pattern: a Kmart, $384,000 an acre, a Walmart at $967,000. This is in a city in North Carolina. When we go to the downtown of that city, we see something like this, a warehouse. It's now been converted into a supper club, $5 million an acre. And my favorite all-time place, Jimmy's Pizza, $3.4 million an acre. 10 times the financial productivity of that Kmart, 3.5 times the productivity of the Walmart. I realize that many of us are stuck indoors right now. If you do have an opportunity to go out and walk, or at the point where you get a chance to go out again, go out on your feet, go out and walk. And if you live in the typical North American habitat, not in one of the major cities, not in an urban core, but in a typical like American habitat, even my neighborhood, which is 4 blocks, 5 blocks from the center of town, we have these characteristics as well. But certainly if you go a mile or 2 out further, you get this in a very hyper sense. Get out on your feet and walk through the neighborhood. And I want you to walk the neighborhood like a strong towns advocate. I want you to, if you've got a street and the street is paved, if you've got sidewalks, if you look over and you see manhole covers and fire hydrants, You've got sewer and water and underground utilities. You've got a street that is costing you $3,000, $5,000 more per foot to build. And so I want you to walk. And every time you take a step, I want you to count 3,000, 6,000, 9,000, 12,000. And then I want you to look. And I want you to look over to the side at what exactly is there. And what you are going to become overwhelmed with, just absolutely overwhelmed with, is that our cities are nothing but gaps. Nothing but massive, massive gaps. There's literally nothing there. Okay, look at Jimmy's Pizza again. When we think about how to get more out of our existing investments, when we think about how to thicken up our neighborhoods, how to increase our financial productivity, Jimmy's Pizza has to be a huge part of the answer. And I'm not saying go build pizza places, but look at the scale of that building. Do we have the capacity to build something like that today? Yes. Yes. Every city in North America has a capacity to build something as sophisticated, as Jimmy's Pizza. This is a simple little box, but look at the wealth it generates. Look at the massive amount of wealth. And not only that, but look at the opportunity created as well. We can go back to these places here, and we often measure success in terms of, are you able to get one of these? Are you able to attract one of these to move to your community? When we look at Jimmy's Pizza, we understand fundamental, right? Where are the profits for Jimmy's Pizza going? They go to Jimmy. And who's Jimmy? Jimmy's your neighbor. Jimmy, goes to the same church you go to. Jimmy, kids go to the same school that your kids go to. Jimmy banks at a local bank. Jimmy has, advertises in the local newspaper. Jimmy has a local insurance agent. Jimmy hires a local accountant, local attorneys. There's a whole different type of economic ecosystem created when we get a Jimmy as opposed to one of these. Now, when we look at the challenge we face today of rebuilding our economy, is that Jimmy may be struggling right now to pay his rent because, Jimmy doesn't have any customers right now today. Everybody's locked in their homes. There's nobody coming out. Maybe some people order pizza. Maybe there's some fundraising to help Jimmy out. But we look and we say, well, this guy is in a hurt. This guy's hurting. This guy's going to go away. Here's the reality. Jimmy's Pizza, what else is going to go in that place? What else is going to go in there? You could have a number of things. Obviously, this is a pretty flexible building. It's pretty adaptable. That's why people built them this way, because they can become many different things over time. But if we just look at that and think about the next 6 months, what's going to go in there? You know what's going to go in there? Jimmy's Pizza is going to go in there. Because whoever owns that building has their own kind of chain of debt and obligations, and they're relying on someone being in that space. It's not like Jimmy going out of business today is going to, all of a sudden tomorrow, we're going to have, Tommy's Pizza House come in and rent that place because Jimmy's defaulted on his rent. No, Tommy's out of business too. When the economy kicks back up again, these places are very adaptable. They'll come back. They'll come back quickly, and they're most likely come back with Jimmy. When we look at this development model, a lot of these places are going away, and they're not coming back. They're not coming back. A lot of small towns right now are going to lose their Walmart. They're going to lose their Kmart. A lot of big cities are going to lose these stores as well. This is an incredibly fragile model. And while today we're all rushing out to get toilet paper, at the big box store, because that's the only place we can get it. When these places come back, they have huge debts. They have bloated balance sheets. They are underwater. They are incredibly, incredibly fragile. How do we differ? How do we start to build a stronger, more adaptable framework? We could talk for hours and hours and hours about this. I'm going to give you a few big picture things to think about and put in your brain and start to process. The first one is this, and this is a fundamental tenet of strong towns, it's a fundamental tenet of adaptable systems. We must everywhere at all times allow the next increment of intensity by right. We have to allow every neighborhood to grow and adapt and evolve and become more intense. And when I say by right, what I'm talking about is we have to have the minimal amount of regulatory burden in making that happen. People should be able to walk in at 9 a.m. to City Hall with a completed permit application and walk out by noon with an approval. That's what by right means. Let me put a little bit of nuance on that. And I think this is a very important one. At Strong Towns, we say this a lot. No neighborhood should experience radical change, but no neighborhood can be exempt from change. Every neighborhood has to evolve and adapt and change. Every single family home needs to be allowed by right to add an accessory dwelling unit, by right to convert into a duplex. Every duplex needs to be allowed by right to become a 4-unit structure. Every property needs to be able to evolve to the next increment of intensity. When we deny that our neighborhoods, we're condemning them. We're putting them under glass. We're making them static systems, and static systems ultimately are fragile and fail. But I'm also sympathetic to the people who say, I don't want my neighborhood to experience radical change. Right now, the bargain we've made with our neighborhoods is a dysfunctional one. And it goes something like this. 95% of you, we will lock in place. We will use the heavy hand of regulation to save you any stress involved with your neighborhood changing in any way. We will, in a sense, lock them, put them under glass, and freeze them as if they were museum pieces. But then 5% of you, 5% of the neighborhoods are going to experience such radical change that it won't be recognizable a decade from now. We're going to take single family homes and build 6-story condo units. We're going to take a framework that you're used to, and we're going to radically transform it overnight. And so the fight that we have is, what neighborhood is next? Who is the next in line? And what happens is it's very easy for everybody to line up against adaptation, against change, because that's what it looks like. That's the only form that it comes in. I'm sympathetic to the YIMBYs, the yes in my backyard, who are fed up with our neighborhoods being frozen and not allowing them to adapt and evolve and meet the conditions that we have in this country. Urgent conditions of housing affordability, of livability, and of capacity for people to remain in their neighborhoods. I'm very sympathetic to the YIMBY argument. I'm also sympathetic to the NIMBY argument, the not in my backyard argument. Because if I have to choose between that development pattern or stagnation, I'm going to choose stagnation every single time. That's not an irrational thing. The Strong Towns approach is not splitting the baby. It's not an attempt to bring two sides together. In fact, both these sides tend to get really angry at us for very different things. It's a recognition that if we want the strength and resiliency that comes from complex adaptive systems, we have to allow our neighborhoods the capacity to adapt complexly over time. We also have to not allow them to become overwhelmed with resources, because if you study complexity, what you find is that an abundance of resources actually induces complicated development. It takes a system that would respond to feedback, and by overwhelming it with resources, it eliminates all that feedback and makes it back to being merely complicated. We need our neighborhoods to be complex and adaptive. The next thing I want to throw is comprehensively lower the bar of entry. We have, for many passionate reasons in this country, raised the bar of participation in our society. We've said, if you want to fully participate, here are the things you need to be able to do. We must, if we want people to be able to start with nothing and end up with something, which is what we want in our cities, towns, and neighborhoods, we have to actually lower the bar of entry so people who do not have the resources to get started can actually get a go of it. Let me show you what this looks like. This is something that we call a tiny house. Our ancestors would have called this a house. I can walk out my front door today and I can walk down the street and I can see dozens and dozens of this size structure in my neighborhood. Why? Because this was a starter home. This is what people built when they were getting going. We look today and we've got the Federal Reserve buying all the mortgage-backed securities. They're trying to hold off, stave off another housing collapse. It's crazy. We're like 2 weeks into this financial reset and we're already looking at a housing market collapse. That is largely a function of leverage. We use debt to juice housing prices. Juicing housing prices, again, in this complicated framework, has a whole bunch of positive impacts on our economy. It has a lot of negative impacts, though, and the biggest one is that it makes our system really, really fragile. Another one is that it makes it very unaffordable for people. If we look back at this type of building, the idea that someone would get into something that they could afford that would be very small, over time, they could either move up to a different building or they could add on, maybe put a little addition on the back, maybe save up a little bit of money, put on a second story. Again, as I walk through my neighborhood here, and if you go to neighborhoods in your community that were built prior to the Great Depression, what you're going to see, if you look very closely, you can pick out the original structure in these buildings, and then you can see all the different additions over time. The way people start with nothing and end up with something. We need to lower the bar. There shouldn't be, if you want to build a tiny home, first of all, we shouldn't call it a tiny home. We should just call it a home. You shouldn't have to go, meet all the requirements of a house and then, also meet the 18 sub requirements of a tiny house. A 600 square foot home is not a tiny home. It's a starter home. You shouldn't have to go beg permission from your neighbors. You shouldn't have to go and genuflect in front of a bunch of different committees. This is just a standard way of building, and it needs to be allowed by right everywhere where people would want to build them. Here's another example. This is from our 2018 Strongest Town winner, Muskegon, Michigan. Muskegon had a gap in their streetscape. They had a downtown that was struggling to get people into it, a lot of empty shops. They went out and in an attempt to lower the bar of entry, they bought a bunch of storage sheds. They painted them up funky colors. They put them along the street here to kind of close that gap. You know the Thigmotaxis, they're creating a wall here. This is really good urban design. And they rent them out really, really cheap to startup entrepreneurs, crazy people who don't know they can fail. What they're doing is they're lowering the bar of entry. They're making it so that people can come in at a very low price point, start out, try out their idea, and understand what a local entrepreneur here is doing. Literally, here's what is going on. They are saying, how can I be a neighbor and doing it? The entrepreneurs find it the most beautiful thing we're trying to create in our communities. How do we serve one another in a framework that allow me to survive and to pay my bills? That's what a community here in Muskegon, they have a low bar of entry. And guess what? When you go to the downtown and you look at it, it's now full of life. Those businesses are thriving as well. The storefronts are full. There's all kinds of life there. And some of that is people who got their start here, who did proof of concept, figured out how to run their business, made their mistakes when the stakes were low, and have now graduated into the core downtown. This is how we lower the bar of entry and welcome more people in. Finally, I'm going to give you this idea here to mull over. We're going to do a whole course on just this idea here because it's such a central part of what our conversation is. But I want to leave you with this one because I think it's critical. When we do big infrastructure projects, there's a certain scale to them. There's also a certain energy to them, certain energy that just goes beyond where people are. For years, I did these kind of projects as an engineer, as a planner. I was on these project teams. We would have our public input where we would, present our plans. We would line people up. We'd let them come up to the podium and speak their piece. We would maybe be proactive and have little tables where they could go around and ask questions. But none of that stuff ever affected the overall design. That's not where we started. We started from a very different place and kind of imposed an order on the place through our infrastructure projects. We have built more infrastructure than we could ever use. And the reality is that over the next 2-3 decades, we're going to actually have less roads, less pipe, less sidewalks, less utilities. We're going to actually shrink our cities down to a size that is manageable, a size that is productive. And so we need to shift from a top-down infrastructure investment model to one that is very bottom-up and iterative. Here's how we do that. We respond to how people use the city. Once you get used to this approach, you are going to find an infinite number of investments out there to make. The problem is, the challenge is they're all small investments. There's nothing you're going to go write a grant for Washington, D.C. for. There's nothing you're going to go to the state capitol. There's nothing you're going to go to the bonding agency for. There's no millions and millions of dollars of projects. There's millions of dollars of projects, but they're all very, very small. And they're standing there right in front of us, just begging us to recognize them. Here's how we recognize them. And this is the 4-step public investment process for building a strong town. It's ridiculously simple and ridiculously effective. First, go humbly observe where people in the community struggle. I use the word humble intentionally here. We need to go out without a preconceived notion of what we're going to find, without a preconceived idea of what should be. And we are going to actually observe where people are having a difficult time using the city as it has been built. The idea of walking a mile in someone's shoes is apropos here. Walk next to them, experience the city as they experience it, have them narrate their experience. This is how we will learn what the urgent needs are. Second step, ask the question, what is the next smallest thing we can do right now to address that struggle? I'm going to emphasize here the next smallest thing. It's our kind of propensity to go out and do the biggest, grandest thing that we can do. What is the ultimate solution we can have? What's the thing we can get the big grant for? What's the thing we can get the huge revenue stream for? How do we solve this problem once and for all? Listen, no problem is ever solved once and for all. Everything in a complex adaptive system is a stress and an opportunity that we react to over and over and over and iterate. And so if we discipline ourselves to say, what's the next smallest thing? We will not only be taking the right step, but we'll be allowing the system to respond. The third step then, do that thing. Do it right now. Don't form a committee. Don't study it for 3 months. Don't have some long approval process. It's just a little tiny thing you're going out to do. Go do it. Like, don't delay. And then the fourth step, of course, is repeat that process over and over and over. Jane Jacobs said that cities are co-creations. They work best when we are co-creators in that system. This approach allows us, once again, in this complex adaptive framework, to become co-creators, to take our cues from people in our community, to respond to those cues iteratively, to allow people to then respond to that, and we respond, and then they respond, and all of a sudden we're doing this ballet that Jane Jacobs described. We're co-creating a place. We're allowing the feedback to drive our public investment strategy. This is how we thicken up our neighborhoods. This is how we shift from places that are fragile to places that are strong. This is how we solve very human problems that exist right now. Continue. And I really like Lawton, Oklahoma. I don't mean to pick on them here, but when I was there a few years ago, this is what I found. A big, huge, federally funded infrastructure project to come in and overlay success in $1 million increments along a street, and nothing happened. And that's because they started with the wrong set of questions. They didn't start with the question of where are people struggling and how do we deal with that and how do we make it better. They started with the question of what can we get a grant to do? What is the big project out there? What's the thing that everybody else is doing? What's the thing that can get us the award in the engineering or planning magazine? A different place to start is an example like this one in Memphis, Tennessee. Little Broad Avenue, where they went out with paint and brooms and literally swept up the street and started to transform it one little increment at a time. And not only did they start with where people were struggling and how we deal with that immediate struggle. But they've continued to iterate and iterate and iterate over time, improving this little section of street to amazing, amazing returns. When we humble ourselves to ask where people in our community struggle, when we go out and we make the next smallest investment, when we do it right away, when we iterate and iterate and iterate, we are making low turning public investment that we can make. But we can't help but improve people's lives in the process. And that is the essence of what a Strong Towns approach is all about. We've been here a little over an hour now. I see a lot of people with raised hands. I see a lot of people who have given comments during this. I'm a little disappointed, I'll tell you, because we had almost 1,000 people sign up for this, and there's 100 people on here, and I know why. The program that we're using, Zoom, I read, allows us 100 participants, but allows us 1,000 attendees. I'm hoping that the other 900 attendees are able to watch, if not directly participate. We actually have created a process to now do Q&A a little bit differently. We know we're not going to be able to take Q&A from 1,000 people. We know there's a lot of questions, probably more than we're ever going to be able to answer. And so we have created an Ask Me Anything follow-up for this Thursday. Same exact time on Thursday, we're going to be doing an Ask Me Anything. The thing is, we need you to go to our community site, community.strongtowns.org, and submit your question there. You can submit your question. You can answer other people's questions. You can take part in an ongoing conversation around these questions. You can vote on which one you think is most important that you would like to see answered. After this presentation is over, you're going to receive a follow-up email that will give you the instructions and give you the website and everything you need to do to participate in this Ask Me Anything process. In addition to this, next week we're going to be doing another presentation. We're going to do one next Tuesday. I think it's the curbside chat, but I'm not exactly sure. We've got a big catalog of stuff to share with you all, and we're going to be doing that on Tuesdays here for the indefinite future. As long as we're all locked up here, as long as the drum set's moved out, and I'm going to sit in front of this brick wall, we're going to chat like this a couple times a week. So look in your email for the sign up for the next session. Do me a favor and tell other people about it. Share this with other people. We have an urgent situation now in the United States, in North America, and in the world where we have to rebuild our economies. We have to rebuild our places. And that is going to mean us working together at the ground level to build things that are strong, adaptable, resilient, and that make people's lives better. We've got a lot of work to do, so let's hang in there and do it together. Be safe, everybody. Thanks for being here with me. Thanks for participating in this. All of us here are thinking about you and have a lot of love and compassion for the people in this movement and the people in our communities. Do what you can to make your place better. Do what you can to help your neighbor in this trying time. And thanks, everybody, for being part of our conversation. Take care.